Yeah, I don't know what's gotten into him lately. His dry sense of humor is just getting worse.
Well, maybe it's just a phase.
Did you hear that? Damn it, Cooper, you know I have a channel, right? No son of mine is gonna use a ruler. We wing it in this house. I'm gonna have to write Wyloch a letter.
Alright, let's see what we got here. Dear Mr. Wyloch. Mr., please. You can refer to me as your God King. You may not know who I am. Yeah, I do. We met in North Carolina last year, although at the time I didn't realize who you were. But I have a bone to pick with you. Maybe that's because I didn't realize who you were. I wanted to challenge you to a duel to the death, but my girlfriend informed me that that's not a thing people do anymore. Yeah, girlfriend, sure. So after my girlfriend shut down 3 more of my ideas, she suggested I simply challenge you to a non-deadly craft-off using non-radioactive materials. I suggest that we have your patrons choose the theme and my patrons choose the material. Okay? Mine chose Dieselpunk Skytrain and yours chose salvaged electronics. Yours truly, Franky D. Crafter. Yours truly, your God King.
You better subscribe. The first thing I have to do is get my material. I start taking apart a broken down printer and see what kind of goodies I get from inside it. The best pieces taken from the printer are the pieces that hold the ink and a lot of these little gears. There were so many little gears. So the plan is to build a Dieselpunk Skytrain. I'll be referencing ideas from Mad Max, Metal Slug, and one of my favorite animation studios of all time, Ghibli. I'll be mixing all kinds of designs and elements from these references, hopefully to come up with something more along my style. And like always, I'll be making sure that I keep playability, aesthetics, and story in mind. I'll probably be walking you more through my thought process than the actual building process. I hope you can enjoy this anyways. Alright, let's get this show on track. I think the most important thing about this project will be story. As I thought about what to make, I also thought about how I would use this in a game. I don't run games with a lot of technology, and whatever technology I have in my games is magic based. So Diesel definitely holds a challenge for the build, but in a world of magic, nothing is impossible. I think I can explain it though. Let's say that the world goes through cycles. Within these cycles are different types of resources depending on the level of magic in the world. During this cycle, the essence of magic was at the lowest it's ever been. People were resourceful nonetheless. They figured out how to power machinery using diesel gas. At first, everything was great. The future was in the palm of their hands. I want to start with this section of the build. The section built during this era. This is the actual train from this age. This age was much like our own, only a bit more industrial. I'd like to take the opportunity at this point to highlight some of the things that I learned working on this section. One of my favorite things was actually taking advantage of the shape of some of these plastic containers, something that I wouldn't normally have a chance to do in my normal setting. I might not be as good as Wyloch at working some of these electronics, but that doesn't stop me from trying. I basically MacGyver my own little contraption here for the light. There were lots of new things to explore in this project, metal details for once. These were extremely satisfying to get down on this project. I grew up playing Metal Slug, so I had a lot of references lined up in my head for what I wanted this project to ultimately look like. I'm technically going up against a legend here, so I had to dig down deep into my past and go back into my childhood. Pick up references from there. You always tend to imagine things differently when you see them as a kid. You don't see things for how they look. You actually add on to them, and that's what I'm planning to do here with my references. I remember watching my older brother play at the arcades in Mexico, completely annihilating these tanks that were layered in sheets of metal. The designs were slick, but at the same time, there was something very extreme about them. I would always let him borrow some of my coins because I knew he would get farther than me, and in return, I would get to see more of the game. In addition to that, I also remember the ships from Japanese movies I saw as a kid. Planes that technically shouldn't fly, and moving metallic castles that almost felt alive. That's what I want to build. That's what I'm going for. My only concern at this point with the build is actually the platforms. If you take a look at my videos, I usually make big projects, but a lot of these projects have a lot of surfaces for me to play around with minis. As I built this, I realized that I didn't leave any space for that except for that little small part with the Lego piece. So that kind of worried me a little bit. I think I'm gonna take a little bit of time here to highlight this technique. For the bolts, I decided to use two methods. I rolled up a small amount of cold porcelain and glued them onto the train. More on the cold porcelain later on the video. The glue I used was tacky glue, which I also used for the rest of the bolts, adding it as a drop. For this next section, I'll be mainly using the ink holders that I managed to scavenge from the printer. Cutting some of this plastic proved to be a challenge, so after these pieces, I decided not to use any plastic that was hard to cut. Continuing with some history here. Eventually, resources ran thin. Nations went to war with each other, trying to hoard what little gas was left of the world. Whoever controlled the gas controlled the world. The wars eventually destroyed most of the world's records and art. This is where their technology begins to look less futuristic and more Mad Max, with the addition of many weapons. As there was less gas and more vehicles becoming obsolete, vehicles had to be scrapped and used for reparation for other vehicles. People would weld vehicles together and create new contraptions. A desperation and need to hold what little gas the world had left led to the downfall of this society. Eventually,
everyone died. The end.
Material wise here, I want to really highlight these Lego pieces here. This is an item that I wish I had more of actually, and I'll practically be looking for more of these because they turned out to be extremely useful. I'd like to build a whole platform with these, but for now it'll have to do on top of the driving seats part thingy, you know what I'm saying. Another item that I was extremely happy with was actually the gears from the printer. I was able to use this for many things, and as you can tell, some of it was used for the guns. As I was finishing this section, I thought to myself, this part was probably built during a time where pollution was not even on the radar of concerns. And to make it look even more dieselpunk, I'd figure I'd go with the easiest detail to show that, and just add a few exhaust pipes. Plastic straws and Lego pieces get the job done. Easy peasy. Painting this was definitely my favorite part, as I've never actually painted anything metallic on my channel. I'm going for a rusted look, so I'm definitely gonna start off with a reddish brown, surprisingly enough. I add a black watch and then just kinda dab it away in some places. I start to heavily dry brush some silver. I make sure to dry brush heavier on some areas to add some kind of glaring effect, sort of. I also start to add whatever paint is left over from the past. And for this step, what I found to be the most important thing is to make sure you do more than one coating of this. If you can see through your paint, it's not gonna look normal when you add anything on top of it. It's gonna look like you hand painted it, and it's not gonna look like somebody painted it, if that makes sense. For this section, I add two different colored whites on it. A lighter cooler one, which contrasts like beautifully with the rusted redness, and the other one a reddish paint that I assume used to be white, but because of all the rust is now a tint of red. I wasn't gonna pass on the opportunity right here to cheat a little bit, and I always like to emphasize my shadows. I think that's one of my favorite things to do in general, art-wise. I also stumbled upon a little dilemma here where I realized it was my first time doing a metal piece like this before, right? So it dawned on me I've never done any rusted effects either, so these were two news for me on the same build. So it got to the point where I ended up putting enough watered down paint on my project and I just started blowing at it, like as if, you know, when this piece was being used while it was rusting, some of that rust kind of swept its way through everything. And I'm extremely happy with what I was able to come up with. Just as much as I like emphasizing shadows, I also love to emphasize the lights, the highlights. And this is just gonna make everything pop, especially when you have a design that repeats itself throughout your whole piece. It's just gonna bring it all together. This is probably gonna be the part where I lose you. This is where I put both of these pieces on top of a giant monstrous centipede. Yeah, you heard me right. I couldn't help myself. I had to put this thing on top of a monster. The idea behind it was that these pieces were actually found thousands of years after they were buried by time. And obviously, the people that found it come from an era of actual magic. These people had no intention or knowledge to get these things up and running the way they used to. So instead, they powered it with magic. For this section of the build, I'm using cold porcelain. You should definitely check out the DM's craft on how he made this special clay that is unlike anything I have ever worked with. This clay-like material, if made well, is on par with Super Sculpey on taking detail, but 10 times stronger, which if you recall from my past videos, that was my main concern. The only downside is cure time. It probably took about a day and a half for it to harden, but once it did, oh boy was I happy. There are easy ways to get around the dry time. One of the things I did was, you can take a look back to the video and kind of look for where this monstrosity is in the background drying. So I obviously start with what I'm gonna use the clay with. I leave that to the side and get working on other things. This could be other things on modeling like the legs or things that are not clay related that I'm gonna put on top of this, like the train and the truck part, I guess. You know what I'm saying. I learned from the past never to leave any surfaces just plain. The more texture you can add to something, the better. And an easy way to add texture to everything is just an aluminum ball. That's it, goes a long way. You'll see. Another material highlight here is walnuts? Walnuts? That's what these are, right? Well, I have a build coming up, so if somebody can correct me on that in the comment section below, that'd be all cool. Because it'd be pretty embarrassing if I make a video and I keep calling the material the wrong thing. Yep. Yeah. When the bottom part finally hardens, I start working on the top. And excuse my brain fart here, but for some reason, I start using Super Sculpey. I realized this mistake and rightfully switch over to cold porcelain. I cut out the shapes of the back segments out of cereal cardboard, and add a thin layer of cold porcelain. I end up having a happy accident when the moisture from the porcelain warps the cardboard. This warp ends up making the centipede look 10 times more menacing. You might be asking yourself, why would it put the train on top of the giant centipede? And to that I say, because it's cool. Because it's unexpected, yet it makes some sort of sense. I wanted to mix up reality, sci-fi, and fantasy all in one. I didn't want to think about how realistic the piece would actually be. Wyloch has that covered. I wanted to know how far I could push the subject. When I added the pieces to the top of the centipede, I even added the front of the train section facing the tail, as if to say that when these people put these pieces back together, they had no idea what side was what. The biggest issue I face making tutorials is making things that everybody will find useful. But that's not my goal. My goal is to take those techniques and push them as far as I can. You don't necessarily need to make the same thing I make. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'd rather speak to the artist in you and encourage you to make every piece your own. Talking about making things your own, let's take a look at what Wyloch the God was able to come up with. See, this is what I'm talking about. I will admit, I'm a bit jealous of how functional his train is. I like all the platforms he was able to incorporate into this build. As I concentrated more on the narrative of my piece, I can see that he definitely concentrated more on the playability of his. Very masterfully, shall I add. The small details on the inside of the train here are also something to take note of. I had similar pieces from my electronic scrap, but I didn't end up using them. He might have given me some ideas on what to do with them in the future. Watching his finished product is making me want to revisit my project later down the line. What else would you expect from a legend, am I right? Go watch his video right after this for sure. But for now, let's talk about how my train would definitely kick his train's ass if they were ever on the same track. There were a few things I learned from this collab. First, I need to get my hands on some works. 2, I need to get a better camera. And lastly, I can hold my own against some of the best crafters on this platform. Who's next? And don't worry, Coops is allowed to watch as much Wyloch as he likes. I even let him watch miscasts when he behaves. But no scratch bashing. It might awaken the inner orc within him. And nobody wants to see that. Do you? So there were definitely some things I learned from this collab. I really enjoyed setting up the scenery with the dwarves, but I think it could look better with orcs, but that's later. Another thing is, I probably need to get a better camera. Or I need to get better with using my own camera. I don't know. I was looking at Wyloch's clips right next to mine and I was just thinking to myself like, that looks super crisp. It highlights his projects even more, and maybe that's something I'm lacking. But, like always, I want to thank the patrons, especially for this video. Would have not been possible without them. Both Wyloch's Patreons and my Patreons coming together to set us up against each other. It's extremely fun. It was extremely fun to just interact with Wyloch. He's a funny dude. He's a funny dude. And, yeah, so I'll see you on the next one. I got some ideas for some videos coming up. Hopefully they won't take as long as this one did. Sorry about the delay, but I'll catch you on the next one. Peace!